Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man. Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast. And as always, we're bringing you exciting, innovative, research-based information to optimize your health. And today we've got a special guest host with us, my right-hand man, one of my great friends, Mr. Cody Moxley. What's up, my man?
How you doing? What's up?
So I thought the idea with bring out a new guest host with this is try to kind of change the energy, right? So you guys can get a better personality on how I interact. Rather than just, this boring interview thing. Now we always have someone in person, get a little more energy into the room. So Cody's going to bring you comic relief and massive insights. And our amazing guest today, who I'm super excited to talk with, is Mr. Mike Mutzel, the host of High Intensity Health podcast. What's up, man?
Hey, how you guys doing?
Couldn't be better. Just crushed a workout here in the gym. That's 10,000 square feet, and there was nobody in it. So I can't complain about that. I've been kind of stewing over what I want to ask you for the last number of days, because your skill set and your knowledge base is so diverse. And the thing I love about what you're doing, Mike, is you're taking your passion and you're interviewing the world's greatest authorities in the area of health, fitness, and ultimately optimizing life. So the first thing I want to start asking you, and everybody said, no, wait till the end to ask this, but I think this would be a really good way to open the podcast, is what are some of the biggest things you've learned that have been a change to your paradigm or a shift to your paradigm in the last 12 months?
Yeah, gosh, that's a great question. We tend to think that like having sweeping lifestyle changes, like there's some magic bullet, like there's some latest and greatest technology hack or some keto meter.
You mean shooting light up my nose isn't going to do it, Mike?
You know what I mean? So I've realized, right, like that like the sweeping changes come from these small steps. And just before this podcast, I was outside. We were talking offline. I live in Seattle, Washington. It's usually like pretty dark and cold and stuff like that. So there was a brief 5 minute of the sun was piercing through the clouds. So I got outside and just got some photobiology and all that, and tried to entrain my circadian rhythms, like those little small things, getting sunlight in the morning, meditating, something very simple, like putting your phone to sleep, like say 8 o'clock, okay, iPhone or iPad, computer, night, you're going to bed. Like our family, we put our phones, in this one spot in the kitchen, and they're done, because the temptation is to check into YouTube, check into Instagram, check into Facebook, see who texted me, what emails, how many sales did I get, whatever it is. And those little small steps of just, making routines and habits, I've found, like interviewing all these people that from New York Times bestselling authors and people that are, have a lot of influence doing research and all that, like their sweeping changes, and what makes them successful is not this new technology. It's the small little things that they do.
Man, so that my one of the quotes that I throw out there a lot is, let evolution be your guide. What are you evolved to do? We evolved to be outside. We probably slept outside. We breathed a lot of fresh air. We probably changed our location a lot, which diversified our microbiome. And all these things allowed us to live this amazingly, what I would interpret to be an amazingly vibrant life. Obviously, there's many benefits to being alive now in the most abundant time in humankind. But evolutionarily, we need to reconnect with nature, man. So I'm so glad you brought that stuff up. And I'd love to start there. So getting into the idea of, explaining to our listeners what these things are doing. So, you mentioned AM sunlight. Let's start there. Why should we be doing that? And why is that the most essential thing? And, a follow-up question to that is, if people are in places in the north where there isn't much sunlight in the wintertime, what are the solutions?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Well, now we know the biology of this, and we know this whole circadian clock system. And, when I first came across this research in 2011, I was really blown away. I mean, we've known this for a very long time. And if we just look at animals in nature, I have 17 chickens, 2 dogs. When that sun comes through in Seattle, it's so funny. They will just migrate wherever the sun is in the yard and hang out there. It is really, really fascinating. So inherently we're drawn to the sun, just part of what we're accustomed, like you said, being outside and all that. But now we know that There's, our retina within our eye sends messages to this region of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and that helps to kind of realign basically adapt our physiology to our environment. So getting that morning sunlight is going to tell your adrenal glands to release cortisol and norepinephrine, adrenaline, etc. It's going to help your body, adapt to the day. And then once the sun starts to go away, then that's going to trigger other hormones that help your body adapt to sleeping and resting and recovering. Melatonin increases, etc. So now we know that, from our liver to our pancreas to our bone, our thyroid, our muscle, there's circadian clocks, and they're all responsive to this, exposure of light and the sleep-wake cycles. So it's very important. We know men have higher testosterone in the morning. That is governed by the circadian clock system. Leptin levels are highest in the evening, and we could talk a little bit more about that. So there's all these, women oscillate, their hormones on a monthly basis. So it's very intuitive. It's hardwired. Now we know the biology of this, but there's a lot of what I like to, and a lot of your listeners being athletes and so forth, we know that, fasted cardio first thing in the morning with a pre-workout or a little green tea or caffeine is a great way to not only kickstart your day, but to help, with fat burning as well. And it turns out that our mitochondria are actually really active while we're sleeping. The best time to burn fat, if we're talking about optimization here, could be first thing in the morning, because we're riding the coattails of when our mitochondria and when free fatty acids are being released and so forth. So, what athletes have been doing for a long time works really, really well. And so what are the things that we can do? Like you mentioned, people in, maybe Toronto or way up north in Alberta or British Columbia or anywhere in the world where the days are very short. Just getting outside anyway at the midpoint of the day is a great strategy. The lumens of, I can't remember what the units are, but the energy that the sun is giving us, even if there's cloud cover, is still enough to entrain our body's circadian rhythm. So, I have some clients in Iowa where it's really cold and dark and stuff like that. And I just tell them, look, you still have to get outside, just even 5 or 10 minute bursts. Like, this is a burst of sunlight to help your body kind of realign to its environment and help strengthen your sleep-wake cycles. So that's my strategy. Now, of course, if you're in Alaska or northern parts of the Canadian provinces, you can get these different lights on Amazon and things like that will help to give you some of that sunlight. But I think the best strategy is just, like you said, follow nature, follow evolution. Just get outside no matter what, even if it's just a 5 or 10 minute burst. Because
is that something you believe in, the red light therapy? So I'm looking up the lumens here, and it's suggested 400 to 600 lumens is an indoor situation, whereas up to 6,000 can be outdoor than the sun. Are you suggesting the red light? Is that something you use in therapy?
Our sauna has some light, things in there, but I don't know. Is it smarter than nature? I don't think so. Yeah. I mean, I don't, and so part of like I really, jive with how you introduce this is like, we can't outsmart nature. A lot of us spend too much time inside. We like to think that our houses are clean, but the off-gassing of our carpets, or, our floor, endocrine disrupting chemicals from our couch, our electronics, all this, I like to get outside. So I think nothing can really beat the sun. And being in Seattle, it rains periodically and it's overcast, but I can still get out. And I found, with seasonal affective disorder, bursts, periods of depression where I felt down and out and stuff like that, the best therapy was just to get out and get in it and to be exposed to it, even if it is cold or uncomfortable.
Yeah, and even with those people who, have those indoor jobs, they're stuck inside. Maybe they, can't get out during the day, or they leave for work in the morning when it's dark, get home when it's dark. You find even supplementing with just something as simple as D3 can help, even though it's not necessarily hitting the light sensors, but it can help regulate that circadian rhythm.
Right. And just prioritizing taking a break to go step outside. I think most employers and managers are okay if you go to the bathroom. Well, just walk down the stairs, step outside for, just 30 seconds if that's all you're allowed, and just to get outdoors. And I think a lot of people are realize that employee health, it correlates with productivity. So if your employer is like, no, you got to stand at or sit at your desk all day, just hop on google.com/scholar and type in circadian biology and light exposure and depression or whatever, and maybe present some research to them.
And it's something that I didn't think about when I built my gym. So I literally have just to my right, I have a closet which actually stupidly has a window that would have allowed me to have some outdoor exposure in my office. But for whatever reason, I decided to put a wall between myself and the window. So every time I'm in my office doing podcasts, and sometimes I'll do 3 in a row, by the end of it, I literally feel like my brain is mush and I can't even function. And that's been really my first kind of foray into the detriments of being inside for a long period of time. Because, obviously as an athlete, my entire life, I spent so much time outside, and I've spent my share of time inside, but it's never been massively extended periods of time under crappy fluorescent lighting, and just realized it literally affects my brain, my mood, my everything just is influenced. And this is, affecting your biology is the core tenet that needs to happen for everyone to change their physiology and their psychology, I really believe. So, as we spoke about off the podcast, there's a simple conversation that's being had around, how do I get lean, Ben? What do I need to take, or what do I need to do? And Mike, I love that you brought this up first, because this is step one, man, is like paying attention to your environment. And this is the one thing I think most people just have disregarded over the last 10 years. Give us some thoughts and opinions on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, where we've gone. I mean, I think, for a long time, I was going thinking about, what maybe you were going to ask me, and I was thinking about my evolution and fitness and stuff like that. And when I was 15 years old, 14 years old, I thought I had to have designer whey. I was like, if I don't have this, and then my animal nutrition multivitamin, sure. I really had this mindset, because I was a newbie. Yep. I was reading muscular development and stuff like that. And I thought, if I don't have that, and my family used to joke with me, like, Mike, if you go without protein, you're going to be okay. And I'm like, no, you don't get it. Like, you have to,
Been there. Yeah.
And, now I just laugh at that. I'll have, like I mentioned, we have backyard chickens. So instead of a protein shake from some company, which nutrition has a role, and I take a lot of supplements, but I think the power of whole food is much better. So oftentimes now as a post-workout shake, I'll have raw eggs, like 3 raw eggs, and, maybe some fruit or something, depending upon the intensity or the duration, right? But I think we're getting back to nature. We realize that, whether it's the industry-sponsored research that shaped nutrition guidelines in America in all the wrong directions or what have you, I think a lot of people were realizing now that we just have to get back to nature, and we can't really. There's immeasurable components, for example, in maybe egg yolks that you're not going to get, in a powdered egg white protein, whether it's energetics or there's just, or the stability of the micronutrients. There's a lot of different things. So I think we're realizing that food quantity doesn't matter so much as food quality. For a long time, it was like, all right, as long as you hit your 200 grams of carbs, your 3,500 calories per day, you can put on muscle. But we're realizing that, inflammation can cause, catabolism of muscle. So we're really looking at, I think, getting back to nature, and food quality trumps.
I definitely want to come back to what you just said there, inflammation causing catabolism. But getting into the same conversation throughout my career, you can imagine as a professional bodybuilder, it's so externally focused, right? It's like I need to eat at least 6 meals a day, sometimes 7, and if I don't, I'm going to lose muscle. And now I'm of the mentality that I think it's almost ignorant to eat 6 meals a day in most cases. Like there's really no need. I really believe in probably 4, maybe 5 meals a day in most cases. And sometimes I'll throw, for some people who are really hard gainers, maybe we'll throw 6 in there. But even that, I think, is, overkill. Getting back to, reconnecting with nature, you're suggesting spending time outside. And one of the most simple and brilliant things that I heard very, very recently was the idea that one of the best ways to expand the diversity of your microbiome is just by getting outside in different environments. I'm very grateful that the conversation around the microbiome and gut health has really started to expand over the last maybe even 2 to 3 years, at least in my awareness. Everyone's really started to pay a lot of attention there. What are some of the key things that you've noticed over the last couple of years in your evolution that you suggest people need to be doing to optimize the diversity of their microbiome and their microbiome health?
Yeah, that's such an important question. I think dietary diversity, trumps all. I mean, obviously, like you're saying, different environments are key, but, just having a diverse array of different foods. A lot of us gravitate, especially in the fitness space,
Same foods,
broccoli,
three
and
foods,
chicken
man.
breast, egg whites, and so that's fueling certain bugs, right? But that's also not fueling a lot of different bugs. And so I remember this one study. It was, I think, published in 2014, in May of 2014. It was UK rugby players. They had a very high calorie diet, but they also had a very diverse diet compared to overweight individuals who were kind of on a low calorie style diet. So that to me was like, wow, having a lot of different fruits, a lot of different vegetables, like it doesn't really so much matter about the macro so much as it does of how diverse and what different flavonoids, what different phytonutrients and fiber are you giving to those microbes, because that's going to affect the ecology. But like you said, I mean, just getting outside and getting closer to your food. I really encourage, I know some people can't do this because they live in Manhattan or wherever, but growing your own vegetables. I mean, even if it's just sprouting, broccoli seeds and mustard greens and growing.
Do you do any of
them
that
on your kitchen
education on
counter.
that stuff on your YouTube channel, Mike?
I do, but I find people just want to know, like the bacon cheese keto recipe. Like they're kind of not there yet,
Oh man, no,
unfortunately.
I'm so there, and I'm the guy who wants to learn about sprouting and gardening, and how many chicken or how many. There's another question that's kind of random, but how many eggs a day are you getting out of 17 chickens?
Yeah, here's what's funny about the chickens, right? I mean, they slow down a lot. So a lot of us eat eggs year round. Like, oh yeah, it's December 31st. I'm gonna have a 7 egg omelet or whatever. Well, our eggs during the month of December, our chickens, I should say, only made a very limited amount of eggs during the month of December, and now they're ramping back up. So there's a natural ebb and flow to that. And of course, when you go to the grocery store, there's eggs all the time, and they look all the same. And so we're kind of forcing summer light conditions when the days are very long and the chickens lay a lot of eggs. We're forcing those on our animals, and then we think, well, because I'm eating protein and it's low carb, then it must be healthy. But so anyway, having the garden, we have 400 square feet of garden space in our backyard and stuff, raised beds and all that sort of stuff. And so being closer to our food, growing a lot of it, and having the chickens has really reframed the element of seasonality, which is kind of the whole ethos of this conversation is getting back, closer to nature. And I think eating seasonally trumps macros and all the other thing too, so I think, like right now, especially in northern latitudes, it lends itself to, like you're talking about, less meals, maybe really compressing that feeding window, doing more of a high protein keto style diet, and then maybe in the summer incorporating more of those root vegetables, the tubers, the fruit. So it's not so much keto, and the eating window is longer, the days are longer. So anyway, all these little things have made me reframe how I
And I love that you brought that up, the idea of eating according to the seasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, touching on the whole foods that you kind of keep emphasizing, I think that's a point that a lot of people really overlook, is they forget and they think, oh, I can just take, all these supplements, but maybe they're not actually getting all the nutrients because they're missing the things like the enzymes that are in the vegetables or the fiber and the things that are going to actually help them take in those nutrients that are in the food. So in some cases, taking supplements, they might not actually be getting all of what they're trying to. So do you think that, trying to grow your own food, you're obviously skipping a lot of pesticides and things, but that you might not need to eat as much to get those nutrients than if you were trying to take just a bunch of supplements?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. It's funny. We've been shopping at farmers markets for a long time, and that was a routine. We go to Saturday morning farmers market and get the organic stuff, and the same vegetables that we grow. And this is very non-scientific, so just bear with me. But just from a overall gross qualitative overview, looking at like the carrots that we grow in our backyard versus even organic carrots at Whole Foods versus like the farmer's market, there is a total difference there. And so I think what you're saying is so key, is there are flavonoids, there's micronutrients, there's polyphenols, there's microbes, yeast, whatever. There's stuff in food that we're just not getting, particularly if we go to the grocery store as well. So there's a major difference. And I think, it comes back to, this is another element, I'm sure, Ben and so forth, that you want to talk about, but this idea of hormesis and, and some of the stressors, the cold stress, the lack of water, all that, actually creates a more robust and resilient, vegetable. We know this in grapes, for example, in the wine industry. I can't remember what year it was, but I think 2012 in Napa, it was like really dry or hot or something. And so I guess, the Pinots and the Merlots from that year are really good because the grapes, they produced anti-stress molecules and other polyphenols. So yeah, to get back to your question, Cody, I think it's super important. these micronutrients we often overlook because we're focused on calories and macros. So we forget about those seemingly intangible elements, the flavonoids, the polyphenols that we don't emphasize as much, but they have a huge impact. And going back to how we got on this conversation, to bacterial diversity. So flavonoids, even having things like balsamic vinegar, the flavonoids in olive oil, hydroxytyrosol, and so forth, those help to increase bacterial diversity. So it turns out that if you just have a lot of processed carbohydrates, processed food, McDonald's, etc., those carbohydrates, those glycans, are very easy to break down and so forth. So the microbes just quickly metabolize them. But if you have these more, as the name implies, polyphenols, so there's multiple phenolic rings, those are a little bit more complicated. In fact, humans are not very good at breaking them down. We rely upon our gut microbes to help to break them down for us. And so just by having a diet rich in color, an array of color, obviously not, Pop-Tarts and Fruit Loops, but, these different things that you get from like purple potatoes instead of just white potatoes, for example, broccoli that's more purple in hue, that helps to improve bacterial diversity. And so it's a great way to, and diversity, kind of, what is that? Okay, so what's the whole point of this bacterial diversity? Like you mentioned, Ben, like how we got onto this. Well, a diverse microbiome is more resilient and more stable. So it can withstand some insults. Maybe, for example, someone has an elective surgical procedure and they get an infection and they have to take an antibiotic. Well, a more diverse, therefore stable microbial ecosystem could withstand that insult a little bit better.
Awesome, man. Hey guys, I interrupt this podcast to bring you a special note from ATP Labs. You guys know I've aligned with ATP Labs because ATP Labs is a company that cares about what goes into their products as much as I care about what goes into my body. I've become neurotic since I've been exposed to what exactly goes into our food supply, what exactly ends up in our supplements, and you guys should be too, because you're concerned with your progress. You're obviously intelligent people who want to get the most of your time, of your effort. So I highly suggest you check out atplab.com and enjoy the rest of the episode. So coming back full circle to the conversation around inflammation, because I really want to dive deep on that, because our demographic is, from my experience, relatively underinformed, or maybe perhaps misinformed when it comes to inflammation, potentially influencing catabolism. So, the fitness industry is so consumed, ironic choice of words, but consumed with mass consumption. It's all about how much rather than quality. So, there's these camps around if it fits your macros and things who are just disregarding all the biochemical realities around the responses of food and the microbiome and inflammation. So talk a little bit about, how mass consumption of food may be influencing higher levels of inflammation and potentially catabolism.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Well, I think let's differentiate, there is some good inflammation. Acute inflammation, if you go lift really heavy and create, myocytes, little damage within the myofibrils and so forth, that's a good acute insult, and that creates adaptation. So your listeners know about that. But what we don't want is the chronic kind of smoldering inflammation. And what we see, this happens just like what we talked about, a lack of dietary diversity, a reduced, microbial diversity can create this chronic smoldering inflammation. It's associated with increased intestinal permeability. So the single cell layer, for example, if you get a paper cut, or you're in the kitchen cutting quickly, talking to your spouse, and you cut your finger, your skin is over 7 or around 7 layers thick. So there's a lot of different layers in skin cells in the epidermis and dermal layer, etc. Well, the lumen of your GI tract is only one single cell thick. So you can imagine that it doesn't take much to really cut your skin with a knife or a paper. Imagine it doesn't take much at all to cause some damage to that enterocyte layer. Now, it needs to be thin, because if it was 7 layers thick like your skin, you'd be malnourished, and humans would have never evolved to have the big brains that we do, right? So we need to absorb protein, amino acids, fatty acids, carbs, etc. So that's what's needed. The paradox of the I should say what comes part and parcel with that single cell layer is a lot of our body's immune defenses are on the adjacent side of that single cell. So we have a lot of immune cells that are sitting there waiting so that, if bacteria come in or pathogens, etc., that we can mount an immune response and kind of eradicate that invader before it causes havoc on the body. The challenge, though, is if we have, this is what blew me away and caused me to write the book Belly Fat Effect, is this whole realm of metabolic endotoxemia, and it links right back to this inflammatory concept. And if we were to have a very high calorie meal, let's say an 1800 calorie liquid type shake, and this was actually done at several universities throughout the world, various iterations of this study that I'll mention, a very high, let's see, I think it was 100 grams of carbohydrates and then 50 grams of fat from, I think it was a little bit of lard and beef tallow, stuff like that. So not the healthiest shake, but a lot of us, do have high calorie, weight gaining shakes because we want to put on muscle and et cetera. That caused the absorption of bacterial fragments known as endotoxin. And so bacteria.
Mike, just to understand that,
Yep.
one single massive bolus dose caused this response?
Yeah, so
Wow.
there's a couple different ways to, in labs and in humans, to induce metabolic endotoxemia. So yeah, a bolus dose of calories,
Wow.
just a real high calorie meal. And so, and we know this, we've all eaten high calorie meals. Sometimes afterwards you feel like crap. You need a nap, you're
Totally.
tired, you're like,
Yep.
so intuitively we kind of know this, but yet we're doing this because we want to build muscle,
Sure.
right? And maybe in certain individuals, they're so anabolic, and they're resting so much that their body can overcome this, for short periods of time. But you add this up over 10, 20, 30 years, and then maybe, we see congestive heart failure, we see kidney failure, we see some of the effects, of this accumulate over time. So yeah, great question. A bolus of super high calorie food and liquid fat. So that's the thing. So fried foods, and liquid butter. I sometimes make a bulletproof coffee, but we know that liquid fat is a recipe to cause these bacterial fragments to be absorbed. And so people might be saying, okay, so endotoxins, what are they? Well, they're little appendages on the cell surface of bacteria, and we all have enough endotoxin-containing bacteria in our gut to kill us. And in fact, if we were to get in a massive car wreck or a stab wound to our GI tract, we would get septic. We would get this septic shock.
Right.
That is a very extreme form of metabolic endotoxemia. And so anyway, long story short, these bacterial fragments are very good at stimulating our immune system and causing this smoldering inflammation that we talked about. So it's instead of like, I don't know how to describe, so acute inflammation, very adaptive. Chronic inflammation causes catabolism, cachexia, causes insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm.
It really negates all the things that we're trying to achieve through weight training and through eating cleanly. So that's the thing that I love for people to understand about. And then, like you were talking about, really getting away from eating 7 meals a day and kind of compressing that feeding window and being more focused on quality. So a lack of flavonoids, a lack of fiber, just maybe the 4 cups of white rice, with 4 ounces of chicken breast, like those, relatively simple foods, they don't create the recipe to offset this endotoxemia.
Right.
So that's the thing. So if we just throw in some turmeric root, some onions, some leeks into maybe a high calorie shake, for example, we can negate some of this metabolic endotoxemia. And that's what was so fascinating about some of these studies is they would have these individuals drink this bolus drink. And in some individuals, they would give them resveratrol beforehand. And guess what? It negated this metabolic endotoxemia.
Gosh, that's interesting.
So,
So Mike, talk about that a little bit, man. So compressing the eating window. So, okay, guys, we're only going to eat 12 hours a day. We're only going to eat 10 hours a day. You tell that to a fitness athlete or a bodybuilder, they're going to be in panic to begin with. And then you say, okay, now you can't eat until you're full because we're concerned with metabolic endotoxemia. What's the solution, man? What is, like, someone who's trying to get an excess of calories? Obviously, you and I both know that most people overdo the excess of calories to a point that they probably are causing these inflammatory responses. But what's the solution in your eyes to someone, hey, I want to put on muscle at the fastest rate possible. I want to do it without steroids. And I don't want to kill myself in the process. I don't want to cause, catabolic inflammation. I don't want to cause metabolic endotoxemia.
yeah, great question. So how do we implement this on a practical level?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think, everyone is so different, right? And no one wants to hear that. We all want the protocol. Tell me exactly what to do. But I think being really honest with yourself right now and saying, okay, so let's, because I myself used to eat 6-7 meals a day, and I know that I was tired. My gut was off. I really didn't feel that good. Like, and when I look back at pictures, I looked puffy. Like my face was puffy. I was retaining a lot of water, and that's that smoldering chronic inflammation that we're talking about. So yeah, my ego was being, flirted with because I was a lot stronger and everything like that, but it had a cost, and that cost was this inflammation. So, I think just being really honest and saying, okay, well, short term, like, how am I going to feel in 6 months if I'm able to put up this weight, or if I step on stage and I'm 215 shredded, but what are the long-term consequences of that? And then just being very realistic, like, okay, well, short term, I'm kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, but it's okay because I have this goal, and that goal is in sight. And once I achieve that goal, then X, Y, or Z will happen. But like you and I were talking about before, is like, once we achieve these body composition goals, these physique, almost like egocentric,
Completely egocentric. It's not almost, it absolutely is.
we feel the same after, right?
Yep.
It's we're like, what's next? Is it just more muscle? Is it more trophies? Is it what? And where does it stop?
It never
and
ends.
So
right?
I think,
Yep.
yeah, to what end? And
Yep.
so I think that's where you go to what end? Am I lifting so that I'm healthy and I live to 92, 93 years old, and I'm here for my children's kids, or what is it? Or, so that's what I think. But I think, a lot of people in our space, or in this fitness space, are realizing that, what, a cool strategy would be trying to do more with less. Like you said, try to
Yes.
put on muscle with less food,
Yep.
and keep the body
less
guessing.
training.
Yeah.
And better training. So one thing I want to kind of pull you aside here and come back around to this. So, one solution that comes to mind, it almost seems like a double-edged sword, is, okay, well, I can't eat these massive meals, so maybe I want foods that digest faster so that I'm hungry again in 3 to 4 hours. But that may require me pulling out things that are like fibrous, pulling out things that are maybe more dense. So, some of the listeners out there go, oh, well, I want to eat every 3 to 4 hours, so I have to eat foods that are going to digest really quickly. But then that could mean, removing some of the beneficial foods and also increasing the amount of sugar consumption. Because the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, I'm going to have, every other meal is going to be a liquid meal. So I have faster absorption and faster stomach emptying. Talk about kind of balancing that thought process between, like, hey, eat foods that are more fast absorbing so that you can actually have a period of an empty stomach or stomach emptying, compare it against, continue to eat those really dense whole foods to get your calories. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I think this is where, undulating your intake would come in. So let's say, for example, you're for a lot of people, like a high volume day would be leg day or back day or something like that. So so you're moving a lot of muscles. You really want to get that recovery in. Maybe on that day, throw in the liquid meals. But for example, if you were going to train arms one day, or maybe just chest, for example, and the volume wasn't there, it was a quicker workout, maybe on that day, then focus more on, okay, instead of having a lot of liquid meals and things like that, I'm going to really focus on whole foods and a lot of fiber, a lot of polyphenols, and kind of incorporate and weave in some of that gut health, so that, there's not these major drastic changes and people are like losing mass and losing strength, but, just trying to at least be cognizant of that. And so I think maybe undulating, and maybe on rest days, for example, where, people are kind of sitting around, maybe resting, maybe, going for a short hike, something like that, like try to incorporate that undulating approach. And what people find is, like, and I remember, like, the idea of going on a 24-hour, or heaven forbid, a 36-hour fast, to me was like totally out of the question. I'm like, I'm going to lose muscle mass, that I'm going to lose strength, all these negative things.
You're going to lose it all, Mike. It all goes away. I know it.
It just
I've seen
evaporates.
it firsthand.
Yeah, and then, and I was so, this was, 3 or 4 years ago. And then I, first time I tried to fast, and then I was like, well, I got to have my whey protein, or I got to have those amino acids. And now I'm like, dude, the body's going to be fine without it, and so, teaching the body, to, this undulation and periodization. And, if we look at hunter-gatherer peoples, the photographs of them or pictures of them, a lot of them are ripped, way more ripped than a lot of us that spend a lot of time in the gym,
Yep.
So, but they don't have these things. They don't have liquid calories, like you mentioned. They don't have pre and post workout shakes. They have real food. They're sleeping well. They're moving. They have good relationships. So yeah, I think we can do it, but I think for some people, a good first step is just just periodize these things, and maybe just on lower volume days throw in more real food and cut out the liquid calories and see how you feel.
Yeah, so I really like that you brought up the periodization of your diet, because it seems like too many people try and fixate on one specific type of diet. Like I have to do, intermittent fasting, or I have to eat every 3 hours, 18 hours a day. And it's important, like you said, to give that digestive system a rest, because it will actually improve your digestion for when you're eating those larger calorie meals, which, like if you're not digesting like that meat and stuff, it's fermenting, which is causing inflammation, which kind of causes this circle of decreasing your gut health. So besides periodizing your nutrition, what would be kind of your step one for a beginner to start improving their digestion rate?
Yeah, that is so key. Well, um, before I get to that, just a small side story. Doing these 7 meals a day and all that sort of stuff, I really got into this through bodybuilding friends of mine, back in 2001. And I remember I had such bad gas, and it would clear parts of the gym, like the squat rack pit, and I would blame it on my friend, and he would blame it on me. So no one really knew which one of us was farting.
It's just lingering in your shorts.
So I think for a lot of us, we can resonate with that. So that's not a normal thing, to have really bad, flatulation and like you mentioned, Cody, the putrefaction of protein, because you're not digesting it. So this sounds very, I mean, our grandmothers all probably gave us this advice, but chew your food. For a lot of us, food, we refuel our own body, much like we do with the car. It's like, okay, hurry up, we're on our phone. It's like gas in, gas out, let's go, I got things to do. So making meal a priority, and then going back to evolutionary biology, our ancestors ate with friends, with family, would make a ceremony out of meals, and we've lost that, because our gym bag has a Tupperware container. We eat it in between clients, and we just are on to the next. So slowing down, and there's a lot of hard research. I talk about this in the book Belly Fat Effect, but chewing about 42 bites per swallow is kind of that magic number. Now, folks like Charles Poliquin will say, get one of those ticker counters that bouncers wear or bouncers use at nightclubs, and count how many times you chew. For some people, very kind of left brain, logical, you might like that. For other folks, what I like to do is just every bite, I put down the fork and just think of things that I'm grateful for, really think about the food. And this is a form of meditation. Meditation is just that moment to moment awareness. So just being aware of like, okay, how am I in this moment? How does this food taste? Like, wow, that broccoli is chewy, or it's hard. I have to chew, all these things, just being aware of that, swallowing, pick up the fork, take another bite. So, that can really affect, the amount of food that you eat, the post-meal processing, the gut hormones, and the anabolism versus catabolism of the meal in the post-workout window. It can affect bile release. Bile is so antimicrobial. Talk about a great strategy to mitigate metabolic endotoxemia. Bile release is key. We now find bile acids all throughout the body. They're in our brain, they're in our heart, they go systemic. So we really want healthy bile release. And part of that is just chewing and being mindful. So that's one strategy, is try to eat with a friend. Sometimes what I'll do is, like, if I'm by myself, the temptation for me personally, I struggle with this, is just to eat very quickly and then get back to work. So what I'll do is I'll call my wife or call my mom, put it on speakerphone, take a bite, and pretend like we're sitting there having a meal. They don't know that I'm necessarily eating, and I'll put down the fork and just chew, and then, swallow and talk, and then pick up the fork again. So how you eat, I think, is just as important as what you eat.
I think, in the society we live in, like, I'm guilty of it too. And I've actually learned recently to stop and, just getting on the phone, right? It's so easy to get on the phone and respond to emails and respond to Instagram and social media and do things while you're eating. And it becomes completely disconnected and mindless. And I think that's one of the worst things you can do, because just losing the connection to food, I feel like it, for me, has negatively influenced my digestion, negatively influenced my social interacting with my family and the people around. So that's a big one for our listeners. Is like, put your damn phone down, man, and actually get into the process of appreciating the food, and potentially even influencing the energetic signature of the food. I'm a big believer in everything carries the energy. And if you're just eating mindlessly and you're eating junk, one, you're probably going to overeat. Two, you're probably going to not be concerned with what it is. So just, being mindful of it is, I think, one of the biggest shifts that people need to start optimizing their digestion.
Yeah, and that mindset that you both talked about too is extremely important. Like I was home this weekend, it's like, wow, my food just tastes better. Like when you're sitting around talking. Now it could have just been my mom's a better cook than I am, which is entirely plausible. But actually taking the time to enjoy where you are, everything just seems to taste better anyway.
Well
Moving along, Mike, I want you to, from what I know, from what I gather, you're an advocate of ketogenic dieting, at least from what I've heard in the wintertime. And I'd love for you to talk about the seasonality of how you eat. But so one of the, externally from a distance, ketogenic dieting seems to have a lot of limitations or a lot of potential health implications. And I'd like to start getting into those. The idea of what does a healthy ketogenic diet look like, and is there such a thing? And do you think ketogenic dieting is, kind of the cure-all that it's being coined to be?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Well, I think there's a lot of applications, and it really depends on the person's biology. We know people that are very, androgenic and have high DHA, sulfate, high testosterone, good levels of androgens tend to do really well on a ketogenic diet. Whereas people that are very estrogen dominant, they don't seem to do as well. And it seems that estrogen does negatively downregulate the liver's ability to make ketones. So, basically, I'll explain the ketogenic diet, and then we can talk about the gender differences and maybe hormonal differences there. But, these ketones, they're so powerful. They're much more than just a simple energetic metabolite that they've been kind of relegated to be in health and wellness for a long time. And so that's what got me really excited about this. I have a degree in biology, and so things like sulforaphane from broccoli, butyric acid from our microbiome, these things all interfere and in a positive way affect the expression of genes, how tightly versus untight, if you will. The histones, these are the fishing wheel like structures that help to protect our DNA. So these histones are really constantly opening and closing to let genes, be turned on or turned off. And of course, genes make proteins and enzymes, etc. When you work out, you affect the histone contraction or relaxation. Well, it turns out that these histones powerfully affect our genes and kind of mirror the metabolic signature that we see with long-term calorie restriction. And so one of the most reliable and well-studied ways to improve longevity in animals and humans is long-term calorie restriction, which no one really wants to do. We're talking about reducing your calories by 20 to 40%. So for a lot of fitness people, that's totally out the window, but we can kind of mirror that same metabolic and immunologic and cellular effect through a ketogenic style diet. So that's what got me really excited about this. And when you're in ketosis, it improves your heart rate variability. And so we talked about being mindful, chewing our food, meditation, yoga, having routines, those are associated with improved resilience, improved heart rate variability. So there's a lot of benefits in my eyes, above and beyond fat loss, above and beyond blood sugar regulation to being in ketosis. But what a lot of people get into the diet for, as you know, is just for fat loss or just for blood sugar. And so this idea that we've been talking about, woven into this entire conversation about microbiome diversity, about resilience, about food quality versus food quantity, that gets lost in the narrative of keto, and people just focus on the macros, as carbs, and all of a sudden, by the way, they say carbs are bad. And as athletes, so the cool thing about this is we can weave in the element of carb cycling, and so kind of overcoming, like you said, Ben, those limitations of keto. And so we can be mostly keto, but if we're going to go deadlift 500 pounds, you want to have some carbohydrates on board. At least I do when I don't deadlift 500 pounds, by the way. But when I deadlift, when I squat, when I do pull-ups, I'm bringing carbs with me to the party because I want to have a good workout. So anyway, so is it a panacea for everyone? Definitely not. For those, anabolic people, women that tend to be, put on a lot of muscle mass very easily, good levels of androgens, I think keto can be very helpful for them. But people that have a lot of estrogen dominance, a lot of belly fat, maybe low carb paleo, compressing that feeding window initially would be great. The challenge that I've had with some clients that are very estrogen dominant and they try to go keto is what happens is when we have very low carbohydrates and low insulin, our liver should sense those messages and start to synthesize ketones. There's a couple of different enzymes that are responsible for doing so. But estrogen can kind of override that and prevent the liver from making that alternative fuel substrate when glucose is low, that is the ketones. And so these people can feel lethargic, dizzy, crash, have low blood sugar, and they don't have those ketones on board. Whereas those of us that are Caucasian, there's a couple different genetic regions. For example, individuals from Saudi Arabia or of Portuguese descent, they have what's called a SNP, or a single nucleotide polymorphism, in the enzyme that synthesizes the ketones. And so this HMG-CoA lyase is very important in taking fatty acids from either our diet or our adipose tissue and synthesizing and making that into ketones when our blood sugar and our insulin level is low. But individuals from Saudi Arabia, it turns out, in Portuguese, and there are other variants, but those two groups definitely have for whatever reason, a sluggish HMG-CoA lyase and synthase enzyme. So for them, when they cut out the carbs or they fast, they may feel really dizzy, lightheaded, and so forth. So yeah, not for everyone, but there are a lot of other benefits to the brain, for inflammation, for longevity, that I think are very attractive, and that's what gets people so excited about it.
Yes, I'd actually like to circle back briefly to you were talking about, people generally in the fitness industry associate ketosis with, fat loss. But is their goal actually the ketones, or is it really just the fat adaptation that you go under during those initial stages of trying to get into ketosis? And then once you achieve that, just kind of focusing on what we call metabolic flexibility, right? The ability to switch to fats and then to carbs, when you go train and things, which can, bring about other metabolic benefits, lactate production and growth hormone release and things like that.
Yeah. I think that's the key. So yeah, the ketones, sure, they do offer some positive effects for the brain and the immune system and all that sort of thing. But I think the key for most people that have desires to improve and have long-term body composition that's stable is that metabolic flexibility, like you mentioned, that fat adaptation. I think that's a key. And the thing is, everyone gets so myopically focused on, carbs are good, fats are bad, or sorry, carbs are bad, fats are good, and so therefore you shouldn't have carbs. But there's this beautiful marriage that can be had for the metabolically flexible, fat adapted athlete. And so, like a lot of us in our evolution, 3 or 4 years ago, fell into that camp that, carbs are bad, you can only go keto, etc. And, realized that I was not getting the mileage from my workouts that I could be. And, Charles Poliquin gave me this, I think it's called Penta 5 from ATP Labs. It's basically
carb, yeah.
Yeah. And it took that for me to realize, like, oh man, yeah, like just the low carb thing. Like, yeah, all the benefits are there for the brain potentially, but man, I've been missing out of a lot of ROI from my workouts because I didn't have the carbs on board. So, yeah, that was
that's
great.
That's what I tell everyone who's can I do keto and build muscle? And I said, can you? Potentially. Is it going to be your best case scenario? Absolutely not. I've yet to meet anybody who's been a really effective. Really effective at accumulating muscle tissue, without the use of obviously massive amounts of exogenous hormones on a ketogenic diet. It just doesn't seem to work. I mean, I've tried it, and I honestly think I wasted 18 months of my career trying to go low carb for too long because of bad advice. And like as you say, man, there's no way you can perform. Can you be as strong? Maybe. Like if there's guys out there now who are doing the ketogenic approach and they're doing strongman, and I'm like, okay, or they're doing powerlifting. I'm like, okay, well, when you're doing singles, maybe you can do that, right? But if anything that requires any type of metabolic stress or any type of carbohydrate store to be utilized, it just doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. So I want you to talk a little bit about, Mike, about the effects of cortisol when it comes to ketogenic dieting. And I want to start understanding, and I want our listeners to understand, is it possible to or is ketogenic dieting negatively influencing cortisol, and is it possible to have a healthy cortisol level on a predominantly ketogenic diet while still training intensely?
That's a great question. This is something this comes up quite a bit. I think it really depends on the person, going back to individualizing this, but I haven't noticed, if anything, I've noticed more resilience and improved heart rate variability. And so I think, the cortisol ebbs and flows and the peaks and troughs, the spikes, if you will, seem to be kind of attenuated on a ketogenic diet. Now, that obviously is individual. Some people that get very stressed out by this because their blood sugar is oscillating. But when you're in ketosis, increasing dietary fat in general tends to upregulate that PNS, the parasympathetic branch of our autonomic nervous system, and that's congruent with downregulating inflammation and improving stress response and so forth. And so we tend to see a shift towards that. Now, obviously, there are nuances and everyone's different. But because you're not having the ebb and flow of blood sugar, because when you're in ketosis, your blood sugar is compressed down, and the post-meal blood sugar rise is very attenuated. So you don't seem to have as much, you don't need to rely upon the adrenals to bring blood sugar back up should insulin kind of overshoot and drop blood sugar. So that tends to happen for some people. Now, with athletes are naturally more fat adapted and metabolically flexible anyway. And one thing I failed to address here is, as athletes, when we're working out, we're making ketones as well, even if we're eating a high carb style diet. So that's the thing this is very easy for athletes to begin to incorporate into their eating plan. So that's what I would suggest. But for someone that has a lot of blood sugar issues, a lot of adrenal issues, adrenal fatigue or perceived adrenal fatigue, we now know the terminology and vernacular is changing around, adrenal fatigue. I think the keto diet can be great, because we're really kind of compressing that the peaks and troughs in glucose and so forth, and because of this research with heart rate variability, how that's can be improved on ketosis. Hopefully, I addressed sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, man. So one thing that I think that comes up often is, well, how do I eat before, during, and after my workout on a ketogenic diet? Is there any way to maybe optimize my performance in such a way that maybe mitigates the negative performance effects of keto?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is something I constantly tinker with myself. I don't know what I wish there was. The cool thing about a traditional old school bodybuilding diet is it was so predictable.
Yep.
We know this is the amount of protein, amount of carbs, this is kind of how you eat. And I think for a lot of people, we had that down. But with keto, there's so many different things, because you have this element of time restricted feeding and fasting built into the whole program. And so a lot of people, Dom D'Agostino and others in the keto space will say, well, you don't need to eat as much food because, the ketones are anti-catabolic and they'll raise blood leucine levels and may stimulate mTOR and will prevent cachexia and loss of lean muscle tissue. So therefore you don't need to eat as much. But I'll just tell you my personal experience, and some people may argue with it or say whatever, but I think it all comes down to personal experience. I like to have food around when I exercise. Unless I'm doing cardio or hiking or any endurance event, I can that lends itself to utilizing fat to fuel muscle during those events. Cross country skiing comes to mind, mountain biking, all that. Like I do those events. I don't need to have a lot of food for that because I can rely upon my body fat. But when it comes to lifting weights and the neurologic fatigue associated with that as well, not just moving the muscles, I like to have food on board. Sometimes an MCT oil, pre-workout coffee with maybe some grass-fed ghee, sometimes that works. But like if you mentioned, if I'm doing higher rep or higher volume, that's when I throw carbs into the mix. And then depends upon what time of the day I work out, but I usually try to just have a real meal afterwards. And so usually I'll work out like mid to late afternoon, and then I'll have dinner afterwards. Sometimes I'll have a whey protein shake depending upon how I feel or how intense the workout is. But I would definitely experiment for some people. If they're moving a lot of weight, if they've been lifting for a while, doing a lot of volume, don't be scared about carbs around exercise, and try to reduce your carbs maybe, outside of exercise windows, or just compress that feeding window. And that's just another easy way to get into ketosis. Like I think we introduced the call with saying, hey, most people should probably compress that feeding window for 12 hours a day. That is just a natural step to get you more fat adapted and to tell your liver to start making more ketones.
Mm-hmm. Mike, one of the biggest misconceptions I see around keto is people chasing numbers, right? They're chasing ketone numbers, like, oh, I got my ketones up here, and I can still eat cheesecake, and I still have high ketones, which I think is a massive disconnect from the objective of what this is. But can you talk about what maybe some of the biggest misconceptions around ketogenic dieting and maybe what a healthy ketogenic diet looks like. Because you see so many people posting, hey man, I just ate 7 cheesecakes, or I just had 3 pounds of bacon and I'm still in ketosis. Talk about, obviously you're a very health oriented, longevity focused man. What does it look like for you?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. Well, I mean, to address that first question, though, I mean, getting excited about having high ketone levels. I mean, let's just kind of flip the equation around. I don't know. Do you guys know of anyone that gets excited about having high blood glucose? No one.
Definitely not.
Well,
Definitely not.
ketones are energy. I mean, that's
Yep.
what they are. Your liver is making that because glucose is absent or there's not enough of it around, and insulin is low. So let's not be mistaken here about what ketones are. Now, it turns out that for the brain, maybe for the immune system, like I talked about some of the epigenetic effects that ketones offer, sure, there's side benefits to having high ketone levels. But just because you have high ketone levels, that does not mean that you're burning fat. And so that's what, like, what if all three of us were to fast, for example, for 24 hours, our ketone levels probably wouldn't be very high. It's in the non-athlete, in the non-fat adapted individual, that their ketone levels are very high from doing simple things, right? So for fat adapted people, what we'll find is that if we get more fat adapted, our body is utilizing that fat for fuel. Just like in a very insulin sensitive person, their blood sugar doesn't get up to 200 after something simple, right? So that's more representative of metabolic, dysfunction or metabolic inflexibility. So anyway, hopefully that kind of helps to clarify. And I'm not saying to downplay the importance of testing ketones, but I think it's very important that people simultaneously test blood sugar and ketones at the same time so that you're getting a better idea of metabolically what the body's doing. And what you'd ideally want is low blood glucose and moderate levels of ketones. But for fat adapted individuals, you'll notice that your ketone levels are not going to be 6, 7, or 8 millimolar. That's going to be something that you're going to see, quite honestly, in people who are supplementing with exogenous ketones, or they're not very fat adapted, or people that fast maybe for 7 days. And so they're really, their liver's cranking out a lot of ketones. But what does it look like? Well, the kind of the framework of the ketogenic diet is kind of built on time restricted feeding, like we've been alluding to. So you're compressing that feeding window, trying to emulate what the sun is doing. So eating while it's sunny and not eating, when it's dark out. But for me, I like to focus, microbiome diversity, stability trumps all. So for example, for breakfast, it might be 3 eggs and half of an avocado. Depending upon, the activity I did the day before or the activity that I'm going to do that day, I might throw in a handful of pecans or sprouted, walnuts, Brazil nuts, something like that. Depending upon, what I'm doing again that day, some days I'll skip lunch, some days I'll have lunch. Lunch would be, again, maybe more eggs because we eat a ton of eggs at our house, some, 3 to 4 ounces of grass-fed meat. Some days I just have, vegan sources of protein. So again, soaked and sprouted nuts and seeds with some sort of vegetable. So I love spicy Mizuna greens, arugula, Swiss chard, kale, sometimes raw, sometimes cooked, sometimes steamed, sometimes sauteed. So trying to vary how I prepare the vegetables. You're getting different flavonoids and micronutrients in that way. And then, for dinner, for example, if we're talking like a 3 meal a day program for most people that are active, I think that's pretty reasonable. Usually, again, I work out kind of late afternoon, so I'll have some post-workout carbohydrates. Maybe these would be tubers, root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, things like that, or a purple, sweet potato or yam, things like that. And then my wife makes a lot of soup. So she, in the crock pot, always has some sort of soup going. And we like to use a lot of mushrooms, different types of mushrooms. They're very good for the immune system. They're a good source of protein. So we always have a soup going of some sort. And usually it's a low carb soup with a lot of different turmeric and burdock root and, a lot of, medicinal, properties to it. And so we'll pair that with whatever protein that we're having or whatever veggie dish. And again, if we eat carbs based upon the activity. So if it's a very active day, we'll have more carbs. If it's a relatively sedentary day, which doesn't happen often, but it does, then we don't incorporate the carbs. And then, not so much worrying about where my ketones are at, but more thinking, okay, where's my strength? Where's my, how's my midsection or abs showing or not? How do my pants feel? Are they loose or they feel kind of normal? How's my energy? How's my sleep? Like looking at all these different proxies, not just trying to get super myopically focused on the ketones to see how things are affecting, and also gut health. One thing that a lot of people notice when they first go keto is they get constipated and dehydrated. So
Right.
upping your salt intake and water intake can be very essential too.
So actually, you touched briefly on, you were talking about your food and soaked and sprouted grains. Could you just touch on what the benefit is you see on that? I'm assuming that would have something to do with like the lectins or the gluten, because a lot of people tend to avoid grains because they're afraid of consuming gluten. So
Yeah.
I was just wondering what the benefit of soaking and sprouting was.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's trying to minimize some of these anti-nutrients that we can be exposed to. So, plants, walnuts, Brazil nuts, they don't have legs and arms and stuff like that. They can't run away from predators. So they make anti-nutrients and as a way to decrease herbivory. It's a natural defense mechanism. And by soaking these things overnight, and this is well known in the whole raw food vegan community that took off in kind of the early 2000s, and Nourishing Traditions by Sally Fallon, great book that goes through the importance of this. And then most recently, I'm sure you guys have heard about this, Stephen Gundry, The Plant Paradox. So
Yep.
we're kind of re-emerging this every decade and rehashing it. And the point is, not to be scared of plants and that plants are bad, but that there is, plants have natural defense mechanisms. And by we can mitigate that. And soaking and sprouting is one mechanism. The other mechanism is just eating fresh food. So Stephen Gundry in his book, he talks about how plants, once you cut them off the vine or the stalk, etc., they start to make anti-nutrients. And so this goes back to, meal prep. A lot of folks in the fitness community, like every Sunday, they cook all their meals for the entire week. Now that has a time-saving advantage, right? Because you're cooking once and eating multiple times, but a potential downside to that would be the anti-nutrients that are created from not having the fresh food. And so when possible for folks, we recommend just like taking food from the farmer's market, the store, whatever, cutting it and then preparing it and eating it right then, not letting it sit around, because that may potentially, if someone has allergies, if someone has autoimmunity, if someone's susceptible to depression or inflammatory conditions, that they might want to consider that aspect of their food prep.
Awesome, Mike. So I want to dig deep into your book a little bit, because I think obviously you're a wealth of knowledge, and I want everyone to go out and buy your book. So tell us about the contents of the book and why you wrote it.
Yeah, great question. Well, I wrote it. I was seeing a lot of nutrition clients back in 2005, 2006, and I realized that these people that were very overweight ate way less food than I did. And I thought, that is so crazy. Either they're lying or there's something else going on here besides calories, and the calories in, calories out. Maybe the metabolic effect of muscle, maybe the microbiome. And so that was kind of what caused me to dive into doing more research and stuff like that. And then there was a medical assistant at the medical clinic that I worked at who underwent bariatric surgery, and right after their surgery, she lost a ton of weight and didn't change her diet at all. She was still eating, cheesecake, like we talked about, soda and all that, but she was dramatically losing fat. And so I thought, gosh, there's got to be more to the story to this gastric, bypass bariatric surgery. So I went into the medical school library. I was living in Denver at that time, and started to dive into the bariatric surgery research. And it turns out that the main mechanism of gastric bypass surgery is how it affects the gut hormones and how it affects the microbiome. So that to me was totally eye-opening, because most doctors talk about, well, when an individual gets gastric bypass surgery, well, just a calories in, calories out equation, their stomach's smaller, so therefore they're eating less. But it turns out that by manipulating the intestine via surgical intervention, there's a dramatic upregulation in these incretin hormones. These are hormones that are higher order in how they affect insulin and how they affect glucagon, how they affect leptin. So these are upstream metabolites that really affect our entire endocrine and metabolic system. And it wasn't being talked about, at least at that time when I was doing the research in kind of the mid 2000s. So I just went headfirst and dove into all the research that I could, and would Skype and call these researchers and pick their brain and ask questions. And so wrote the book. And so that was the premise, that the gut is a key metabolic, endocrine, immune organ. and like all the things that we've talked about today, having phytonutrients, having fiber, those are great for our gut bugs, but they're also good for our gut hormones. And our gut hormones are key again for improving insulin sensitivity, insulin sensitization. So in post-meal processing, just by chewing your food and eating mindfully, taking deep breaths, being grateful, the energy of the food, that can affect our gut hormone release. So that was big premise number one. Big premise number two, in brief, was the idea that our immune system has a metabolic characteristics. And so when we think about diseases like lupus, like MS, like asthma, like food sensitivities, gluten sensitivity, whatever, those inflammatory immune cells thrive on sugar, thrive on glucose. And so if we can become more fat adapted metabolically, we're affecting the organ that affects our longevity. That's our immune system. We know this whole field of inflammation, this idea that as we get what accelerates aging is kind of a dysregulated immune system. So to affect our body's longevity, to affect performance at a high level, we have to have a healthy immune system. And a metabolically flexible physiology lends itself to a less inflammatory immune system tone. And so, in the book, I introduced this notion of immune tolerance, and that there's these different cells that are like little policemen, and they can turn down inflammation. They're called the T regulatory cells. And so one way to make them happy, of course, is to become more fat adapted. So the book really, it gets a little advanced. I'm working on version 2 that is more layman friendly with more recipes and more how-to stuff. But the book kind of provides a big overview and summary of a lot of this academic research, which unfortunately doesn't make it to the inside the health and fitness magazines because it's too complex. So I was like, I want to break this down because this research is really fascinating, but I think a little bit too complex for the average Joe to just go pick up a journal. So
Man, it sounds absolutely incredible, though. I'd love to dive into it because obviously everyone is interested in understanding fat loss optimization, fat health. And one thing you talk about is fat cell health. And I'd like for you to talk about that just briefly as we wrap this up.
Sure.
What does that mean? What does it look like? And how do we influence it?
Yeah, that's amazing. It's wild. Our adipocytes, our fat cells, are cross-talking with our liver, with our pancreas, with our muscle tissue, and so they're very metabolically active, immunologically active. If we look at in children at the age of 4, if you biopsy their fat tissue in lean versus overweight children at that young, you can start to see phenotypic. You can see changes within the fat cell. They're becoming more inflamed. There's more macrophages, T helper cells, all these different immune cells become infiltrated. Wow. So fat is alive. It's very active. And there's a lot of things, like exercise and detoxification, like all these different lifestyle factors, circadian rhythm balance, that can be lost within the overweight individual within their fat self. So yeah, there's so many other lifestyle factors besides the calories in, calories out model that affect fat cell health. And so I do talk about that in the book, and all the conversations that we discussed today can help to contribute to a more healthy fat cell.
Amazing, man. So what is the one thing that you want to tell all my listeners that need to start doing now that's going to have the greatest impact on their health and performance?
Yeah, gosh. I'm
that's
sure
a tough one, I know. But
people have talked about this before, but just being grateful. I think so much, dis-ease, depression, anger, these feelings of like, oh, I'm going to get that person back, and, vindictive behavior, all of it, even, body dysmorphia and all that can be traced back to just, just not living in the present, not being grateful. And so I think, this is something I constantly remind myself of, and even like a lagging body part. Some people are like, oh, my calves are small, or my forearms are small, or my nose is too big. Just being grateful that you have a nose, or that you have calves. A lot of people don't have, they lost extremities or were born, without certain things. So just that can have so much carryover into your business, into your relationships, into your health. Like it's crazy. You read some of these studies. Marty Seligman at Penn State has this one grateful exercise where he has he had an intervention group and a non-intervention group. The non-group didn't do anything. The intervention group wrote a letter to someone about how grateful they are, etc., and then read it to that person. I'm sure you guys have heard of the study, and the carryover was recognized for over a month. I mean, and so it's amazing just having a little bit of gratitude, how that can affect your whole life.
That's great, man. You know, one of the greatest realizations I've had recently was the idea that mirrors and cameras have only been invented in the last 200 years. So prior to that, what did you look like? You had no idea what you actually looked like. So, you know, we're kind of entering the age of vanity, and everyone's so concerned with how they look, and I've got weak this, or I've got to fix that. It's absolutely ridiculous. You know, prior to 200 years ago, we didn't have a clue. So, you know, maybe we had less of a self-centered focus. I mean, I don't know, I'm speculating, but the only time we may have an opportunity to look at ourselves would be if someone was looking at us, or if we're looking in a stream, like when, you know, I don't know, the first recorded advent of a mirror was only 1830. And you're like, okay, well, that's not that long ago. So, you know, prior to that, it must have been such a different perception of self, you know. And so if people start to realize that, and maybe that thought alone will allow people to shift on being so attached with their, you know, their appearance and their ego's desire to look a certain way.
Yeah. I've never thought of it that way. That makes a lot of sense, though. It's great.
Yeah. So, man, you've got one of the world's best fitness podcasts. If everyone wants to go check you out, one, where do they go? Two, which podcast should they go? Which one was one of your favorites that they should go check out immediately?
Yeah, gosh, that's a really good question. Thanks for that, Ben. It's called High Intensity Health. So, you know, these are video interviews. You can check them out on YouTube or iTunes. But, you know, I got to say, I mean, it's the most recent episode, 215, with Stephen Lin. He's a great dentist in Australia. You should interview him. All about the oral systemic connection. And like, I'm guilty of ignoring the mouth. You know, we've talked so much myopically, and it's great, you know, about the gut and gut health and microbiome and diversity and all that. But, you know, the entry point to the gut is the mouth. And for many of us, the way that we position our tongue, how we breathe, especially when we're sleeping, all that, you know, really affects our gut, and then affects energy levels and everything, and the health of our mouth. So I think that's a great episode, because it will cause people to think differently about how they view gut health and breathing.
Awesome, man. And very much like yourself, I think myself and a lot of listeners are research enthusiasts and are really trying to better themselves. Could you tell me your 3 favorite books that you'd suggest that I and my listeners go read?
Gosh, that's a great question. So, you know, I love the Heath brothers, Chip and Dan Heath, reading their book right now, Power of Moments. I don't know if you guys have read that. Oh, it's awesome.
I haven't.
Let's see, Viktor Frankl.
So, what's the Power of Moments? Give me. Is it like a business book, or is it more just like personal development?
Yeah, it's both. So anyone that has a business would really benefit from that. But anyone that, I mean, you know, basically, we remember these strange moments, you know, that seemingly. So he talks about what makes a moment memorable, and then he talks about how to recreate that, how to, you know, for example, you know, if you have a business, your customers and customer service, now you can create little spontaneity and how that will affect. So yeah, that's a really, really good one. But yeah, both business and personal development. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. I thought that was an awesome. You guys have read that?
Life-changing.
Yeah. And then let's see. Gosh, what's another one? A Whole New. These are kind of like mainstream books, you know. But I really like A Whole New Mind, and Daniel Pink. I like him. He's a journalist in, I think, the Bay Area. But the idea that, you know, we used to really reward left brain behaviors, accounting, you know, law, medicine, and all that. But the idea that right brain, more empathetic, more creative, more, you know, connecting the dots between A, B, and C, and synthesizing to kind of reward that, and how, you know, those endeavors. Because I'm kind of like an artist at heart a little bit, you know. There's a lot more opportunity in career development, you know, for people that are right brain and kind of can synthesize and connect. Whereas a lot of left brain activities, you know, accounting, law, engineering, and so forth, is being outsourced overseas or automated by robots. And so as we look in the future, you know, really kind of, you know, flexing that creativity muscle, I think is key. I think it's really cool. So those are 3 books that I'm biased. I like them, but there are others.
Beautiful, man. Well, hey, I'm sure I'm going to go and get it myself. I'm sure a lot of our listeners will. So, Mike, thanks so much, man. It's been awesome. I'll tell you what, enlightening experience, and I'm very grateful for you and the journey you're on and helping so many millions of people now and into the future.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for the opportunity, guys. It was a lot of fun chatting with you.
Thanks very much,
Thank
Mike.
you,
Have a
Mike.
great day.
All right, guys. Producer Trevor here to announce the winner of our January ATP Labs contest. So BagsJens, thank you very much for supporting, for commenting, and for liking the podcast. Please email stereolabstudios@gmail.com to claim your prize.
Thank you very much for tuning into the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you love it, give us a share, leave us a review on iTunes. You can also access the show notes at benpakulski.com/podcasts. Head on over there and leave us a review as well. And I hope you guys enjoy it. Have an awesome day. Building muscles, building minds. I love you guys. Peace out.